Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and whether you're joining us here in person on Park Avenue or online at stbarts.org, it is my delight to welcome you to the forum where each week we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. And this morning, we are really honored to have with us, finally, Vann Newkirk II. He was scheduled to be with us a few months ago, and at the last minute, we had to postpone his appearance, and we're really glad that we were finally able to make it work. Vann is a senior editor for The Atlantic. In addition to writing and editing for the print publication, he has also done a lot of audio work with The Atlantic and is the host of two acclaimed podcasts for The Atlantic. The first, Floodlines, which is about Hurricane Katrina and its aftermath, and the second is Holy Week, which is about the week after the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. died. If you haven't listened to either or both, I highly encourage it. They are both kind of moving experiences. Vann, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. First of all, I want to thank you all for having me as well for the forum, and thank you, Peter, for being my conversant today. As you said, I was supposed to be with y'all, I think in February, but I caught COVID for the first time in my life on the way up. I was miserable, and so I thank Peter and the team here for taking care of me then and helping me figure out a way home. I am really glad to have this makeup date, especially because I got to experience the hottest week of all time in New York. So thank you. But I'm glad, though, to be back here now. It honestly feels like the right time. The coming of summer for me is always something of an inflection point, and this one feels like a big one. Obviously, there's a little election coming up, may be important. And now's the time when things start to get serious in the races. More broadly, democracy is under threat here and worldwide. Affirmative action here is gone, and all kinds of programs to help address hiring gaps and wealth gaps are being dismantled. The Supreme Court has been incredibly busy rolling back rights previously protected by legislation and previous decisions. There is a concerted effort to limit the kinds of history that we can teach our children and who can do the telling. A felon who vows to essentially overturn our institutions may well be president in a few months. There's still a war going on in Gaza where Palestinian children and civilians are still dying every day. And again, it's one of the hottest weeks in history. I don't know if students in the future will even have history textbooks, but if they do, I'm pretty sure there'll be a few entries about this moment. Across America, a lot of people are trying to figure out how we got here. That's what magazines and newspapers like my own are trying to do, making sense of just why we live in such challenging and sometimes chaotic times. But that's not a question that polls or columns or debates or talking heads can really answer alone, because fundamentally that's a question that can only be fully answered with history. Knowing our past, our true past, is crucial to understanding the nature of our world and our effects on it and one another. In my work, I'm guided by a quotation from the science fiction writer, my personal fave, Octavia Butler. If you haven't read her, you should. She said that, quote, "To study history is to study humanity, and to try to foretell the future without studying history is like trying to learn to read without bothering to learn the alphabet." Much of my work over the past few years has been trying to learn the alphabet, to use history and memory to better understand the present, and to know a little bit about where we might be going. It's tough right now, but I'm trying to hold Octavia Butler's truth in my head in a time when we just had an observance of the federal holiday of Juneteenth, and when it might be at the same time illegal to teach the history of that holiday in many schools in the country. And when I'm not even sure the things that I write can be taught in the schools where I grew up. But I hope to talk to you all today about that work, about why it's even more urgent now when we are seeing Black history being marginalized, and about where this all might be going. I mentioned Juneteenth because to me it's such an object lesson in the ways that our understanding of Black history has changed radically in just a few years. I used to write a story every year about the celebration of Juneteenth. When I started, it was mostly a regional celebration among Black Texans and was far from universal even among the Black community. Now it's a national holiday. And now you have people talking in public about the end of slavery and what it meant. But also, you see some of the magic of the original celebration being stripped away. There's an impulse to simplify the holiday to be simply one of freedom granted to Black people, rather than a day that should make you wonder if that freedom ever really actually came. But I think any celebration of Black history, including Juneteenth, it should not mollify you. It should shake you up a bit. I've been working at The Atlantic for most of the past decade, and it is my considered opinion that most of us could use a little shaking up. I've covered the violent rallies in Charlottesville, the steady erosion of voting rights, protests against police brutality, and the January 6th insurrection. Each of these has to do with how we understand and use history in the present. I've tried to use my career to unearth and re-examine pieces of history that help us understand the moment. In that, I've tried to emphasize what I like to call history from below. That is, history that comes from memories, stories, archives, publication, and places that aren't considered elite or mainstream. But what I've seen more and more is that in this work, those kinds of history are disappearing faster than ever, often before they are ever recorded or heard. We are in a race against time, and most of us don't even know it. That's all happening at a time when my profession is facing an existential crisis. I probably don't need to tell you all much about what's happening in journalism. Local papers have disappeared, and now there are even major cities without a place where you can go read the local news. News TV is being consolidated, as are the remaining papers. The old business models for news, for media, for journalism, they just don't work anymore. And many of the places that we relied on to give us insightful and reliable journalism online, especially about Black communities, about minority communities, they simply no longer exist. And artificial intelligence is threatening to eat whatever remains. All those factors are why we at The Atlantic pursue projects like Holy Week, the documentary podcast that tells the story of the week after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Now, if you haven't listened, I am entirely unbiased and I recommend it. But after King was killed on April 4th, 1968, there were riots and uprisings in over 100 cities in America. The assassination and the riots changed the course of the civil rights movement and of American history. And they clearly made a mark on DC, the city where I work. But I always wondered in my life growing up why there weren't more projects on that time period, more documentaries and shows like there are for every other part of the civil rights movement and for the rest of the 60s. That curiosity was the reason why we started digging and started even thinking that we might be able to do a show on this event. Over the year of reporting that followed, I talked to people who were on the streets in DC, Baltimore, Memphis, New York, and other cities in that week. I talked to politicians and White House officials, including people who were in the room when President Johnson was informed about the assassination. I talked to activists who were in Memphis, including one of the Black radicals who was King's very last meeting in his motel room before the assassination. The story that we came to in fits and starts was one that I think transformed my own understanding of the movement and gave me more information about that old question of how did we get here? Now, speaking to so many people who were there with so many different vantages, even though I grew up with the civil rights movement as part of the fabric of my household and understanding, it still helped deepen what I knew about the movement and how I came to think about its relevance in my life. I came to reckon with this great collective grief that had shaped my parents' and grandparents' lives that I didn't really understand before. I also came to understand that the Black nonviolent tradition and Black radicalism were not purely oppositional forces, but they were stops along a continuum of freedom seeking. Most importantly, I better understood our present-day racial issues not as newly emergent or resurfacing, but as direct consequences of the business left undone in 1968. Now, it's kind of hard to get too in-depth about a show I imagine a lot of you have never listened to or heard of. But one thing that stood out was an interview with John Burroughs Smith, that Memphis radical who met with King on the day he was killed. John wasn't with all that nonviolent stuff. He thought King's nonviolence was just a way to appease white moderates and Black middle-class drivers. But after King came to town and called for a general strike in support of the Memphis sanitation workers, John came to admire and respect him, and he volunteered to be a marshal for a nonviolent march. He also realized that King wanted to work with him and was convinced that while King would never accept violent resistance and John's personal brand of radicalism, he was honestly trying to grapple with it and understand it. To me, that interview and those takeaways are the essence of what we're talking about today. Most of what we know about the civil rights movement and about Black history in general comes from relatively few sources. We know about the major events and people who broke into the mainstream consciousness through official sources, and sometimes interviews with prominent leaders, with folks who were in the White House, with people who have the names that we all know from the textbooks. In the story of the civil rights movement, we often have, this is how it goes. You have segregation, you have the Montgomery bus boycott, the Birmingham campaign, the March on Washington, and Selma. And you get King, and you get a couple of his lieutenants named. That is how most of us learn about the civil rights movement. You see similar dynamics with, say, the Harlem Renaissance, or even Reconstruction and the Civil War and slavery. We all are taught about them, but what we are taught has such a narrow aperture that what we understand a single story, and usually it's one of that's triumphal and of overcoming, and not from the perspective of people who were struggling. And this all marks what Julian Bond called the, quote, master narrative. The master narrative is limited by necessity, and while it can be part of the truth, it is rarely the whole truth. The master narrative tends to center how events appeared to the mainstream and captures how they wanted to process the event. In the case of the civil rights movement, you have King, the great man, an even greater martyr who fought an evil system but who emerged victorious and helped set the country on the right path. This is, however, a rather limited perspective and doesn't explain why, say, racial disparities still persist in our society. It's what I like to call history from above. What I said originally is that I like to strive toward a view, a history from below. And that's what I try to do with Holy Week. This past winter, I was also lucky to be able to edit the Atlantic's issue on Reconstruction, that period of American history right after the Civil War. Now, for me, the master narrative growing up in North Carolina, of all places, was that Reconstruction was a failure, that it was, in many textbooks, a mistake. And so growing up, I was reading books about how giving my ancestors a right to vote was a tragic mistake. That was not a marginal position. That was not a minority view. In fact, when editing and putting together this issue, we found a previous Atlantic series on Reconstruction from 1901, where in that issue, the editorial line was that Reconstruction was a mistake. And we featured a series of writers, including one who defended the Klan, who were all arguing that this period where black folks were first experiencing freedom in this country, that it had been done wrongly, that it had been pursued in error. So if the Atlantic was saying that in 1901, you can imagine that that's sort of where the rest of history was. In fact, there's a school called the Dunning School, which was the dominant presentation of history that said pretty openly that this plan to give civil rights, to grant civil rights, to protect civil rights among black folks was one of the most tragic mistakes in American history. That was, even up until the 1990s, I would say, the master narrative on Reconstruction in America. That's changed over time. Over the past 20, 30 years especially, there have been much more scholarship and research and folks who are doing big documentary projects that present Reconstruction as a failed experiment, as a time when America came close to reaching its actual promise of being a democracy, and that era was shot down by people who didn't want it to be that way. Even that, though, is based on a relatively few sources, on voices like the Venerable Frederick Douglass, on the perspectives of white abolitionists, on the movements and doings of politicians and presidents. But when we started working on our issue on Reconstruction, I hope to balance those very necessary parts of history with a little bit of history from below. So I wrote a story about the Fisk Jubilee Singers and based it on the diary of one of their founding members, Ella Shepherd. Ella Shepherd's probably not a name that you know, that many people know. She was born enslaved and helped found this singing group out of Fisk University, one of the earliest HBCUs in Nashville, Tennessee. And during a time when it was broadly believed, again, the master narrative was that black Americans, the formerly enslaved people, did not even have a culture or could not create the kinds of music and high culture that whites could. She helped lead this singing group on a tour across the United States that ended up, number one, establishing the Negro spiritual as a legitimate art form and the precursor to most of our popular music, and also ended up having them go to the courts of the royal families in Germany and England. She and other folks who were not usually mentioned in our big top-down narratives, they had an entirely different experience of Reconstruction, not just as either a failure or a tragic, misguided era, but as a time when they had opportunities, when they could go and reshape the fabric of this country and not really think twice of doing it. They did it out of necessity. So what we tried to do in this issue was to feature stories like Ella Shepherd's and others who we got from letters, who we got from records from the Freedmen's Bureau, who are not in our textbooks or in our big documentaries. We wanted to feature and highlight those voices, not just because they present a different vantage point on history, but because those are the kinds of voices that we are losing more quickly than the ones that are in all of the most prominent works. We have archives that are sitting in libraries that are being defunded. We have collections of letters that have never been digitized that we don't know ever will be. We have so much of a wealth of information about how people in this country actually lived that have never become part of the popular understanding of how this country works. And how do you all think that colors how we think about the world? For me, it's important to do this kind of work connecting Black history to the present, especially in the Atlantic, because that work is in our DNA. The magazine was founded as an abolitionist publication during a time when being an abolitionist in America could get you killed. And it featured work from Frederick Douglass, from W.B. Du Bois, from Charlotte Forten, Martin Luther King, and James Baldwin. Part of our founding mission was to explore the American idea, to define it and understand it. And among mainstream publications, ours was one of the first places to state that Black freedom was a part of that idea. Now, today, we are in the middle of one of the most consequential struggles over that idea, that American idea. And while it may not seem much like it on the surface, much of that struggle, many of the issues that are the most hot button or schisms in our family issues, they have to do with Black history and Black freedom. Take a look at the Supreme Court and its most controversial cases, including voting rights, affirmative action, and health care, and even whether Trump can be on the ballot. All of those revolve around the 14th Amendment, which was passed during Reconstruction with the original intent of protecting the rights of Black free people. And many of the decisions that have stripped away protections have relied on interpretations of the amendment and of history that ignore their original intent. To me, the court is just one of the reasons why Black history is so crucial to understanding today. If you want to understand, say, the problems with American education, you have to start with the fact that American education was segregated for most of this country's history. You have to know about the history of affirmative action to do that. If you want to understand the problems with American healthcare, you have to understand that that system was also segregated for most of this country's history, and that a significant portion of the population was subjected to generations of violence, pollution, and medical neglect. If you want to understand modern party politics, I think you have to have a good understanding of Black history, from the assassination of MLK to the murder of George Floyd. Now, the usefulness of Black history in knowing our way around and understanding the present is exactly why it finds itself under attack today. I talked about the fact of book bans, and there are critical race theory bans now. There are limitations on histories that say claim America is fundamentally racist or that make certain children feel uncomfortable. We live in a moment where perhaps even more so than the 60s, there is open censorship on the kinds of history, the things that you can teach children about Black people in this country. Ultimately, these bans are all attempts to narrow the aperture even further of what the master narrative is. And they all seek to do a single thing. They all intend to create an environment where everything that happens to us, where everything that happens politically seems novel, where the things that are happening in our elections, they feel like they come out of nowhere, where somebody can go and claim that the protections that are now in place for voting rights, for getting people to the polls, are actually weapons to bring in a bunch of illegal voters. Because if you don't understand the history, those are much easier claims to swallow. This is all why I think this moment calls on all of us, of all races, to build what I call insurgent archives, to take photos, to, in many cases, pass the mic, to fund Black artists and archivists and libraries and museums that are collecting Black history, especially Black history from below. What we have right now, depending on how this election goes, is a race against time. we are looking at the next 4 years at least of an America where it is illegal or frowned upon to teach, to collect, to even promote a lot of Black history. We're looking at a time when it is going to be harder to learn about, say, Juneteenth than it would have been for my father to learn about his own history in his own schools. And that's happening because forgetfulness is the most important tool of an authoritarian government. So for me, memory is the most important thing that any of us can do is to preserve memory, to promote it, to fund it, to support it. And maybe we can talk about that.
Thank you so much, Vann.
Thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions. If you're here in the room and have a question, should be question cards on your tables. Natalie Johnson will come around and pick them up. Raise your hand if you need a comment card and don't yet have one. If you're joining us online, you can type your questions into the live chat function on YouTube, the comments on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. While we're waiting for those questions, Vann, you talked a lot about the value of history, and I know that when you were putting together Holy Week, that was right after the protests around George Floyd's murder, the intensive conversations around racial justice in 2020, and I'm wondering how you saw the parallels between those two time periods, the present in which you were looking at the past and the past.
So the parallels, I think, were at least aesthetically and visually obvious. You had, in '68 was the most widespread mass protests until 2020. You saw people on the streets at a level that you hadn't seen since 1968. And both of them were in response to murders of Black men. So there were obviously, I think, the facial sort of, the superficial resemblances. But when you actually started digging into it, you saw the more substantive, real connection between 2020 and 1968. You saw people who were out in 1968 who saw it as their duty to go and be on the streets and march in 2020. I think what happened was people understood, yes, the spark for these protests was George Floyd, and it was the murder of George Floyd. And that was the core of what the policy demands were. But people understood in this moment that his murder represented a sort of failure of a promise that had been made in the 60s and had been considered to be sealed with the life and death of Martin Luther King, which was a promise to citizenship. It was a promise to equal protection and civil rights. And when you have a person and you have a series of persons who are killed with that type of impunity, it really highlights and illustrates that that promise has not been kept.
Several questions already. One person wonders if you can comment on the curation of history and
Yes.
how history is and can and should be curated. Specifically wondering, having seen the recent exhibit at the Met on the Harlem Renaissance and what publications were included and which were not.
So curation's always, it's both an artistic and a political choice, right? Anything, we can't include the entire universe of things in any history. And what we choose to include, it does color and guide what the final output is. So I think what you've seen in a lot of rethinking or representation of Black history in the past few years is curation, I think rightly so, has done a lot more to focus on the contributions, on the leadership of women and of queer folks within the movement, and of people who don't get the usual name recommendation. There's been some great stuff on librarians. There have been some great stuff on the women in the churches who aren't, they weren't allowed on the podium at the March on Washington, but who were just as crucial and vital in getting the thing off the ground. I think what that does ultimately, your choice of curation, your choice of what is presented, it can either limit or broaden our understanding. If your curatorial choices only essentially reinforce the master narrative, they're only using the sources and the big things that most of us kind of already know, then what you usually get is you get a feel-good exhibit. You get something that you can go and sing Kumbaya and maybe we shall overcome, and you go home. But I think there are a lot more challenging ways to curate now that people are embracing that help us understand the rough edges and the contradictions and the ways that people were people within this movement. And to me, that's the most interesting thing.
And as an editor, you're a kind of curator yourself. What motivates you as you make these decisions? You talked about the insurgent narratives as one of those things.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, my role as an editor is to tell you something you don't know, is to help find stories that you haven't read. And I take it very seriously, the duty of an editor to both curate, to find writers and stories that are going to educate our audience, but also within those stories to push them to be the most challenging versions that they can be. So what I look for in a good story is one where, even if it is the broad contours of the story are known, where once or twice in the story I sit back and say, wow, I didn't know that, I didn't understand it, or it gives me if there is a story that is widely known, if it gives me a different vantage point on that story. If, I love taking a big event like, let's say the March on Washington again, you give me a history of the March on Washington from sanitation workers, I'm eating that up. Right? For me, that's a beautiful thing. If you want to talk about AI in the present, I want to think about, give me a good story on how AI is affecting people working in call centers. I think there are so many ways to get at these big picture issues that take the camera, to make a metaphor of it, and shift the camera and move us in a different angle. And I think just doing that slightly helps us get a better, more holistic understanding of what the thing is. So as an editor, I'm always looking for stories that do that, for writers that have a knack for that, and pushing them to move even further.
A question about how different generations view the civil rights movement, specifically King and his emphasis on nonviolence, which I know is something that you explore in the podcast.
Yeah. So even during King's life, even in the 1960s, there was a pretty prominent generational difference among Black Americans as to how they saw King. Near the end of his life, it was generally considered the case that younger Black Americans, they viewed his nonviolence as their parents' thing, right? That was for them. But SNCC, and then later the Panthers and Malcolm X, they were a lot of their appeal was to younger folks. So I think that dynamic has always kind of been, it keeps getting repeated over and over again. And that's just, some of that's just naturally the way that I think people, that generations work. But also, I've seen, conversely, I have seen a lot more uh, I would say, radical reinterpretation of King himself. So I think for a very long time, one of the reasons why why King didn't resonate with so many young people is because the king that they got was not actually king. So you got a lot of, you got the couple quotes from the "I Have a Dream" speech, King. You got the not the content, not by race, but content of a character. You got the king that was the image of king that sought to keep people from doing anything, as opposed to the king that was always agitating, always trying to find a way to be inconvenient to people who were upholding white supremacy. You had people actually citing King, and still have people actually citing King in opposition to, say, folks marching on the street, which is just, it was sort of in a funhouse mirror type situation. So what I've seen among a lot of young folks is actually looking back at the real King and reconsidering what his radical, nonviolent confrontation meant and how they can apply it. And I think actually, if you look at how a lot of mass protests have gone over the past couple years, they really have used a reimagined and reapplied form of that radical, nonviolent confrontation. So I would say, I think what I see now is, for the first time in my life at least, a critical reassessment of King and what he actually did and meant.
And your podcast has been a part of that.
Yes,
Yeah.
it has been, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do it. In 2018, we actually edited an issue of the magazine on King, and it was sort of started out just, okay, it's the anniversary of his assassination, we should do something. But in doing the research and actually looking at the archive and his letters and looking at letters of people to him and how they saw him, what I realized is that, my understanding was entirely inadequate. So that issue became that type of reassessment. And the question that was dangling for me at the end of it was, how can we tell a story of a movement where in most narratives that movement is considered to be universally victorious? They did the thing, and also say that it ended with his assassination when he himself viewed the work as having just started. So that led us to Holy Week.
And there's also been a major biography of King released in the last year or so. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really Jonathan Egg's King. It's a doorstopper. It's a great book, though, and I think if you haven't read any of the older, sort of classic King biographies, it's a good place to start.
Question on the role of religion, both in terms of evaluating history and also in the fight for racial justice. Obviously, King himself was a pastor and preacher. You titled the podcast Holy Week, I think, for a reason. On the other hand, the loudest religious voices these days may be suppressing history. So thoughts on how the church, in so many different forms and functions, operates?
Well, I think you can probably tell from the podcast and the episode titles that I'm a church boy. And for me, growing up in the African American liberation theology tradition, those two were always, history and faith were always, and the actual institutional role of the church, they were braided together. Though there was never any separation between those things in that tradition. So for me, the idea, King himself was braided in that tradition. King was brought up in that idea that his leadership, his earthly leadership, had to be, it was connected to his spiritual leadership and development, and that he could not fulfill his role as a faith leader without being someone who fought for liberation of black folks. And you could not do that without understanding the history of black folks. And so King was an avid historian, an avid reader of history, somebody who did his own archiving, who did his own interviewing. You see the same thing with James Baldwin, who, although he was an atheist, he grew up in the church. And he considered those to be the biggest gifts that were given to him. If you read, let's see, I'm trying to think which Baldwin work I want to draw on. Anything, his reporting, Baldwin's reporting is an instinct that he draws on from the church. He wants to understand how things came to be. And so for me, coming out into the world and seeing that you had faith leaders, you had churches that were trying to split them or didn't see them as intertwined, it was alien to me. It was something that was I didn't understand for the longest. And it's something I don't know if I quite, it still feels odd or strange to me, but I know why it's being done. And I think you see now, church faith is a very powerful tool, and it can be a very powerful weapon. And I think what we see today is that those institutions being turned into a weapon of forgetfulness. And that forgetfulness serves a very political purpose. I think just as, it's interesting to me, just as to me, the church, politics, liberation were always intertwined, you kind of see the inverse of that now, in a different direction now in certain evangelical movements. You see now that these churches that were once, things were walled off between the faith and the physical world. Now they are political machines. So I think actually in a bizarro kind of way, the priorities of that liberation theology tradition have been inverted and taken up by that movement, which is, if you're a theologian, it's a lot to chew on. But as a journalist, as an editor, it does give me a lot of interesting things to assign stories on, because at this very moment, when you have that ascendant and possibly victorious movement, you have the widespread and wide-scale disappearance of the black church. You have a lot of rural black churches, like the ones that I grew up in, that are just packing up or losing their entire congregations or don't have money to continue to pay their bills. And so the countervailing force that we would expect to have in, say, a 1968, it doesn't have the same kind of strength as it used to.
All right, we only have a few minutes left, so I'll
All right.
try to fit in as many questions as possible. A question about the connections between the fight for racial justice for the black community and the fight for racial justice for other kinds of people of color, specifically Indigenous Americans and continental Africans.
Yes. Well, to me, there are, the word that comes to me from Du Bois is solidarity. And I think for much of the history of the movement, of the Black American movement, things were sort of siloed off. You had a lot of thinkers like Du Bois who really tried to expand the footprint, who really tried to make common cause with global indigenous movements, with African liberation. struggles, and also with Asian American liberation struggles. But that didn't really become the dominant mode of messaging until, I'd say, the present day. I'd say when you look at movements like Black Lives Matter and you see their platform, and their platform is based on primarily solidarity. You see it's based on moving in lockstep with, again, what Du Bois called the people who are subjects of the global color line. It's, you see planking the platform for justice for Palestinians. You see planking the platform where they are moving in solidarity with folks in Sudan right now. And like, I think that line of thinking actually, one of the shifts, the generational shifts that I think is real, it's much more natural to young folks now to view those struggles as tied together and joined. And you can see it in how they protest and what they protest for, and in just, I think a remarkable level of awareness of global events now.
And to invoke another struggle as a final question, you do a lot of work on climate change and the environment, and I'm wondering if you can, you started off today by talking about just how hot this week has been, if you can talk about the connections between environmental justice and racial justice.
Yes, so environmental justice, I love the term. When I wrote a story about it in 2016 for the New Yorker magazine. And to my knowledge, it was maybe the third time it had ever been mentioned in print. And now everybody, there's an Office of Environmental Justice. So that'll tell you alone both, I think, how much our understanding of the world of environmental justice has changed and has been accelerated by racial justice movements over the past few years, but also how much climate change has made it unavoidable. For me, going back to King, which is always a good place to start, he in 1966 helped author a document called the Freedom Budget. And in the Freedom Budget, one of the demands that they made of the American government was to provide equitable environments for Black Americans. This is something that was in 1966, and that would have been considered environmental justice. So for me, the two are one and the same. And I'm working on a book about the environmental history of blackness, of Black space, because to me, I think we've sort of carved out the environment as its own separate thing, as a silo. To me, you cannot have a history of Black Americans, of Indigenous Americans, of any America, without having environmental history be a part of it. So to me, as we've understood racial justice, it's always been lacking of that environmental frame. And I think now that we are looking out in the world and thinking about climate change and climate justice, we should not be so quick to take off a little bubble of climate justice and have the rest of our big climate concerns. We should think about our climate system as one that is the way it is because it is fundamentally unjust. And from there, I believe, we can get to the real solutions.
Okay, I said that was the final question. One final question. You talked about the election coming up. I can tell from some of the questions that were submitted, that's also on the minds of many others in this room. Clearly, you believe a lot is at stake. How should we be paying attention to the next few months? You're a journalist, you're kind of on the front lines. How should we be listening and thinking?
So I think, as I said in my remarks, this is the time when things really ramp up. We're going to have conventions soon. We're going to have the actual, Labor Day is usually when the real advertising and get out the vote efforts start. So what I am looking toward is what I'm seeing as the main indicators and the main things to pay attention to. It's young voters. I think so far they have not really been engaged or been a part of this process, and I think the understanding what it is that they want, what it is that is going to move them to the polls, that's going to be, I think, the thing that swings the election either way. And also, what I'm looking at right now is whether the historic, over the last, it's really been 16 years since 2008? Wow, over the last 16 years, there's been historic levels of black voter participation in our system. And we've seen signs in 2022 that might be dissipating. So for me, what I'm really paying attention to is what's happening with ballot access, with voter ID laws, with base enthusiasm, with both candidates' ability to go out and reach voters. And I think we really could, there are two ways that this can go. One way is we see these last 16 years of black Americans being a really important force in our electoral politics that's here to stay, or it's not. And so I think that is, if I had to define what is really at stake, that to me is one of the things at the top of the list.
Vann Newkirk II, please join me in thanking him. We really appreciate you being here and appreciate all of you being here as well. Next week, as we celebrate Pride Sunday here in New York City, we're going to have another journalist with us, Jonathan Merritt of the Religion News Service. And we hope you'll come back and join us for that, and hope you'll also stick around this morning and join us for worship, whether in person or online at 11 a.m. Thanks so much.
All right.
I'm going to run off.